The first blow was a closed fist, snapping her head back with a crack that echoed in the sudden silence of the crowded hallway. The second was the aluminum bat, swung not like a threat, but like a tool of demolition, aimed with cold precision at her legs. As Lena crumpled, a marionette with its strings cut, the only sound was her choked gasp for air and the rhythmic, sickening thuds of the bat finding its mark. The boys in the blue and yellow jackets weren't angry. They were efficient. And in the stillness that followed, as they stepped over her broken body to check their phones for the video, not one of them could have imagined they had just signed the death warrant for their entire world. What you just heard was the beginning of the end for Northwood High. This is a story about the day the unthinkable happened, and the quiet mother who refused to let it be swept under the rug. If you believe that some lines, once crossed, demand a reckoning that shakes the very foundations of a community, then you need to hear this. Subscribe and join us, because what came next was a storm of vengeance and justice the likes of which this town had never seen. The American flag snapped in the brisk autumn wind outside Northwood High, a picture of idyllic, small-town normality. Inside, the reality was a different beast. The hallways were a river of adolescence, churning with the raw, unfiltered currents of hope, anxiety, and brutal social stratification. Into this ecosystem, Lena Evans was introduced not as a new species, but as fresh prey. At 22, she was a ghost walking among the living, her presence an uncomfortable reminder that life doesn't always follow a neat 4-year plan. Her faded denim shorts and soft gray top were a stark contrast to the branded athleisure and varsity jackets that denoted status. Her silence, born of a hard life that had forced maturity upon her too soon, was misinterpreted as a challenge. She had seen things these kids couldn't imagine. Hospital vigils, eviction notices, the grim determination of a parent working 3 jobs. She carried a gravity that their orbit of parties and pep rallies could not comprehend, and for that, they marked her. The architects of her torment were the princes of this domain. Jason, with his quarterback grin and eyes as empty as a vacant lot, led the pack. His right hand, Mark, was less a person and more a force of destruction, his baseball bat a constant companion, a phallic symbol of his power that teachers pretended not to see. Their court was a rotating cast of sycophants, all basking in the reflected glory of Friday night lights. They were untouchable. Their fathers sat on the school board. Their mothers organized the fundraisers. Their names were on the plaques in the gymnasium. They operated with the unshakable confidence of those who had never truly faced a consequence. Their every misstep a story to be laughed about later, their futures a guaranteed trajectory of success paved by legacy and leniency. The harassment began as a low-grade hum, a hissed freak as she passed, a deliberate spill of a soda on her backpack. Lena, a veteran of life's harder battles, tried the strategy of invisibility. She became a phantom, drifting through the halls with her eyes down, her shoulders hunched, hoping the storm would pass. But her refusal to break, to give them the tears or the rage they so desperately craved, only infuriated them further. It was an insult to their authority. The digital torment began, a cascade of anonymous hate on her sparse social media, memes crafted from surreptitiously taken photos that highlighted her difference. The sharks were circling, and the water was getting warmer by the day. The attack in the C-wing hallway was not a crime of passion, it was an execution. It was the final, logical step in a campaign of dehumanization. The dim, fluorescent lights flickered over the scuffed orange lockers. The final bell had rung, and the hallway was in that transient state of near emptiness. Lena felt a prickle of unease, a primal awareness of danger, but she pushed it down. She was thinking of her shift, of the mindless, comforting repetition of packing boxes, of the money that would help her and her mother finally get ahead. They emerged from the shadows near the gymnasium doors not as individuals, but as a single multi-headed entity of aggression. The circle closed with practiced ease. The other students, the ones who would later claim they didn't see the specifics, froze. They became a living wall, a silent, complicit audience. Their phones, instruments of their own social survival, remained in their pockets or were raised not to intervene but to record. "Look who it is," Jason drawled, his voice a lazy weapon. "The charity case. You know, we have a dress code. That outfit is a violation." Alina's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. "Please," she whispered, the word tasting like ash. "I'm just leaving. I have to go to work. Work." Mark chuckled, hefting the bat onto his shoulder. I think you're going to be late. A shove from behind sent her stumbling forward. She collided with Mark's chest, and before she could regain her balance, his hand, adorned with a heavy class ring, snapped out and caught her across the cheekbone. The pain was a white hot star exploding in her vision. She cried out a short, sharp sound of surprise and agony that seemed to electrify the air. The pack descended. They became a blur of blue and yellow, pushing her, pinning her against the lockers, their laughter a harsh, dissonant symphony. A kick landed on the back of her knee, buckling her leg. She fell to the cold, unforgiving linoleum, the impact jarring her teeth. This is when the world narrowed to a single, horrifying point of view. From the floor, Lena looked up and saw Mark standing over her, the bat held high. His face was not contorted in rage. It was calm, focused, like a craftsman about to complete a task. Time seemed to slow, to stretch and warp. The first swing was a horizontal arc into her ribs. There was a wet, internal crunch, and the air fled her lungs in a desperate, silent scream. She curled into a fetal position, a primal instinct to protect her vitals, but it only exposed her legs. The second swing was a downward chop, a brutal, efficient movement aimed at her thigh. This was the sound that would haunt the school for years to come, the nauseating, unmistakable snap of a femur breaking. It was the sound of a life being irrevocably altered. Thin silence, a thick, heavy, guilty silence. Lena lay in a broken heap, her breathing a wet, ragged gasp. The bullies, their bravado momentarily punctured by the visceral reality of their violence, stared at their handiwork. A phone camera, held by one of their hangers-on, continued to record its red light, a single, unblinking eye of judgment. A nervous giggle escaped someone's lips, and it was like a starting pistol. The spell broke. They scattered, their footsteps echoing with a hollow finality, leaving their victim on the floor. The audience of students, suddenly remembering urgent appointments elsewhere, melted away, leaving Lena alone in a pool of her own pain in the stark, indifferent light of the hallway. Sarah Evans was at her kitchen table, surrounded by a sea of bills, the numbers refusing to add up to anything resembling hope. The phone's ring was an intrusion. The principal's voice was a study in bureaucratic calm, a masterclass in downplaying catastrophe. Mrs. Evans, there's been a bit of an altercation after school. Lena was involved. She's a bit banged up. We've called an ambulance to take her to County General as a precaution. The word, precaution, did nothing to prepare her for the sight that awaited her in the ER. The drive was a void. She didn't remember the traffic lights, the turns. She only remembered bursting through the curtain around the bed and seeing her daughter. Her beautiful, resilient daughter looked like a shattered doll. One side of her face was a swollen, purple mask. A deep, angry scratch ran from her ear down her neck. Her leg was suspended in a complex web of pulleys and casts. Her eyes, when they fluttered open, held a hollow, distant terror that made Sarah's blood run cold. The doctor came in, his face grim. He listed the injuries with clinical detachment: 3 broken ribs, a compound fracture of the femur, a severe concussion, contusions covering 30% of her body. The force required to break a femur that way is significant, he said, almost to himself. It was a weapon. The phrase, beaten half to death, was no longer hyperbole, it was the simple, brutal truth. Sarah sank into the chair beside the bed, her body numb. She took Lena's uninjured hand, feeling the cold, clammy skin. And then, in a voice shredded by pain and sedatives, Lena began to speak. She told the whole story, from the first whispered taunt to the final, world-shattering crunch of the bat. She named them: Jason, Mark, Tyler. With every name, every detail, something in Sarah solidified. The grief, the terror, the helplessness, they were all consumed by a new, terrifying emotion, a cold, crystalline, and absolute rage. This was not the hot, fleeting anger of a moment. This was the kind of rage that could plan, that could wait, that could burn down an entire forest to purge a single blight. The next morning, she went to the school. Principal Higgins's office was a shrine to mediocrity, filled with trophies and team photos. He offered her a seat, a cup of bad coffee, and a script full of empty platitudes. He spoke of internal reviews, student conduct committees, and appropriate disciplinary measures, which likely meant a few days of in-school suspension, a slap on the wrist that wouldn't even interfere with the big game. He talked about the complicated social fabric of the school and the bright, promising young men who came from good families in the community. He was a master of the art of nothing while appearing to do everything. Sarah listened, her hands folded neatly in her lap. When he finished, she leaned forward, her voice low and dangerously steady. "Principal Higgins," she began, "my daughter is 22 years old. She has lived more life and faced more hardship than those young men ever will. She was not in a fight. She was the victim of a premeditated, brutal assault with a deadly weapon, witnessed by dozens, and filmed for entertainment. You are talking to me about their futures. I am talking to you about my daughter's present, lying in a hospital bed, and the future she now faces, one of chronic pain, PTSD, and terror. So let me be very clear, your process is a joke. Your concern is for your reputation. But starting today, you are no longer dealing with a sad story. You are dealing with me." The chaos began not with a scream, but with a whisper. It began with files. Sarah was a legal secretary. She knew how systems worked, and more importantly, she knew how to make them work for her. Her first stop was the police station, where she found the initial report, a masterpiece of obfuscation that described the event as a mutual physical altercation. She demanded, and, under the threat of a media firestorm, received a meeting with the police chief. She laid out the photographic evidence, the medical reports, the names. She played him the audio a brave student had sent her, the sounds of the beating unmistakable. The chief, a man who golfed with Jason's father, had no choice. The investigation was reopened, this time in earnest. The baseball bat was discovered in Mark's locker during a new, more thorough search. But Sarah knew the wheels of criminal justice turned slowly, and for a crime like this, even a conviction might mean little more than a few years in a juvenile facility, a blip on the radar of their privileged lives. True justice, the kind that could prevent this from ever happening again, required a more comprehensive demolition. She went to the local newspaper, the Northwood Gazette. The editor, a man whose grandson was on the team, initially refused to run the story. Sarah didn't argue. She opened her laptop and showed him the hospital photo of Lena, her face a roadmap of violence. Then she played the audio. The man's face lost all its color. The story ran on the front page below the fold at first, but the headline was a dagger: "Culture of brutality at Northwood High transfer student severely beaten, allegations of cover-up." The town fractured along predictable lines. There were the horrified, the decent people who organized candlelight vigils and started a meal train for the Evans family. And then there were the defenders, the Boys Will Be Boys Brigade, the parents who whispered in the grocery store aisles that she must have done something to deserve it, that those boys have such bright futures, that this was all a witch hunt designed to tear down the town's heroes. The online comment sections became a digital war zone. Sarah read every single comment. The supportive ones gave her strength. The vicious ones, the ones that attacked her parenting or her daughter's character, were merely more kindling for the cold fire in her soul. Phase 1 was complete. Phase 2 was targeted. Personal annihilation. She found the parents. Jason's father, a man who built strip malls and whose identity was his wealth, received a call. Sarah's voice was calm, forensic. She detailed the criminal charges, the civil lawsuit for damages she was filing, a suit that included not just medical expenses but also projected lifetime therapy costs, lost future earnings, and punitive damages designed to be felt. She spoke in the language of balance sheets and asset liquidation. She could hear the quiet panic in his breathing. Mark's mother, a woman whose life was a curated performance of charity galas and garden parties, received a different call. Sarah, her voice sweetly venomous, asked her how the upcoming Letty's League Luncheon would appreciate knowing their chairwoman was the mother of a boy who got his kicks from beating girls with bats. The woman's social standing, the currency she valued most, began to implode within hours. But the true glorious and terrifying chaos, the storm that would forever redefine Northwood, was unleashed when Sarah turned her attention to the student body itself. She created an anonymous, encrypted email address: Northwood, Truth, @gmail.com. And then, through back channels and whispers, she invited every student, every parent, every former teacher who had ever been victimized, threatened, or silenced by the regime of the Varsity Jackets to share their stories. The dam broke. The inbox flooded with a torrent of pain and rage that had been festering for years. There were stories of a freshman who had been stuffed into a locker and missed for 3 hours, of a girl whose science project was destroyed the day before the state fair because she refused to date a player, of a gay student driven to transfer schools by a relentless campaign of slurs and physical intimidation, of eating disorders sparked by cruel comments about weight, of stolen property, of blackmail, of threats. Sarah received screenshots of deleted Snapchats, records of vile groomy chats, photos of vandalized cars and homes. She compiled it all into a digital dossier of damning evidence. She was no longer just a grieving mother, she was a general, and she had just been handed the command of a silent, wounded army. She requested a special, public session of the school board. The auditorium was packed to the rafters. The air was thick with tension. The boys and their families sat together, a phalanx of defiance flanked by lawyers. Principal Higgins sat at the front, sweating under the lights. And in the back, in her wheelchair, sat Lena, a living, breathing monument to their failure. Her presence was a silent accusation that hung over the entire proceedings. The school board president called for order, his voice trembling. He began to speak about due process, confidentiality, and the need for healing as a community. It was the same old song. Then Sarah stood. She walked to the podium, her posture straight, her face a mask of grim resolve. She did not look at the board. She looked at the crowd. For weeks, she began, her voice amplified but eerily calm. You have been told that what happened to my daughter was an incident, a fight, a mistake. You have been asked to consider the promising futures of the boys who did this. Today you will see the truth. What happened to Lena was not an incident, it was the culmination. It was the rotten fruit of a tree this school has been watering for years. She connected her laptop to the projector. The large screen at the front of the room glowed to life. What you are about to see is the real Northwood High. For the next 90 minutes, she systematically eviscerated them. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She was a prosecutor presenting an open and shut case. She read aloud from the anonymous emails, the names of the victims redacted, but the names of the perpetrators, Jason, Mark, and their inner circle, displayed in bold, undeniable text. She showed the screenshots of the chats, filled with racist, homophobic, and misogynistic filth. She showed the photos of the vandalism, the stolen property. And then she played the audio recording of Lena's beating. The thuds, the laughter, the final, sickening crack. In the audience, one of the bullies' mothers let out a wail and buried her face in her hands. The room was a powder keg of shock and revulsion. She wasn't finished. She then displayed internal school emails she had obtained through a public records request. Emails from Principal Higgins to a teacher, dismissing a complaint about Mark with "he's a good kid, just blowing off steam." An email from the athletic director to the school board, arguing against suspending Jason before a playoff game, stating the consequences for the team would be too great. She exposed the entire, corrupt system from the top down that had enabled this monster to grow. The auditorium erupted. Parents stood shouting, pointing fingers. The local news cameras, which Sarah had quietly tipped off, captured every second of the meltdown. The story exploded. It was picked up by state news, then national. The blue and yellow varsity jackets, once a symbol of town pride, became the uniform of pariahs. Corporate sponsors pulled their funding from the athletic department. College scholarship offers were rescinded. The bright futures were extinguished not by Sarah's rage, but by the undeniable truth of their own actions. The aftermath was a tectonic shift. Jason, Mark, and 2 others were expelled, and as adults, pleaded guilty to felony assault, receiving prison sentences. Their families, bankrupted by the civil judgment and socially annihilated, vanished from Northwood. Principal Higgins and the athletic director resigned in disgrace. At the next election, the entire school board was swept from office by a slate of reformers who ran on a platform of transparency and zero tolerance for bullying, a platform drafted in consultation with Sarah Evans. The chaos had passed. The school, physically the same building, was fundamentally new. The orange lockers were repainted a bright, hopeful white. The fear was gone, replaced by a cautious, hard-won respect. Months later, Lena was walking without a limp, the physical therapy slowly restoring her body. The nightmares were less frequent. She and her mother sat on their porch swing, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight. The silence between them was comfortable, a shared space of survival. "Mom," Lena said, her voice soft but strong. You didn't just get justice. You tore it all down. You started a war for me." Sarah looked at her daughter, At the resilience in her eyes, the set of her jaw that was no longer just pain, but strength. She put her arm around Lena and pulled her close. "No, my love," she whispered, her voice full of a ferocious, unbreakable love. "I didn't start a war. I just finally gave the monsters a name and a face. And then I held up a mirror so the whole town could see them for what they were. I didn't tear your world down, Lena. I cleared the rot so you could build a new one. The halls of Northwood High are quiet now. But if you listen very closely in the space between the bells, you can still hear it. The ghost of a lesson, learned in the most brutal way possible, a warning etched into the very walls. Cross a line, harm a child, and you may just find that the most dangerous force in the world is not a boy with a bat, but a mother with a cause, a plan, and nothing left to lose. This journey from the depths of despair to a one piece shows the power of a single voice to challenge an entire system. To everyone who has been with us through this story, I have to ask, from which part of the country are you watching this video? Let me know in the comments. Your connection to these stories from all across the nation is what makes this community so powerful.